Welcome, my lords, to the White City, where you will learn more about Middle-earth and discover differences and similarities between the Rings of Power show and Tolkien's books, and whether Amazon's show, episode by episode, is worth watching. I'm Philip Dutt, your host, and I'll be joined by Mark Schaefer. I hope you enjoy. Welcome back, and if we think about just the way that the Rings of Power show has gone, and a lot of fans and other viewers just opinions and ratings on it, it's quite wide range. But I think that one thing's for sure is there are some key areas that Amazon could have done better in, such as writing and maybe in a lot of instances also just sticking closer to the lore. So something that we're going to talk about here is kind of associated with what we think might have been better strategies that Amazon could have gone with, and maybe even like ideas of how the second season might be better if they do certain things. Mark, is there anything, what kind of things would stick out to you or whatnot?
Yeah, this is really interesting because I think it's been a while since the show came out, and it's given us time to sort of just, think back on what about the show we like, what we don't like, what we think they did right, what they did wrong, and sort of like to get away from maybe the feelings of just the initial first watching. My first thought, I thought was a pretty interesting thought. My biggest problem with the show is the way they portrayed Galadriel. That's no secret. I didn't feel like it was Tolkien's character, and Galadriel plays a really important role in Tolkien's world. My thought was that rather than having Galadriel be the main character, you could have made Celebrian be the main character. So Celebrian is Galadriel's daughter and Elrond's wife. And she's a character that Tolkien writes very little about. She's also Arwen's mother, so she plays a very important role in the Tolkien's world, and is also a character that very little is known about. And so if they really wanted to write their own character, they could have made Celebrian the main character, and given her a lot of these rebellious or very violent qualities that Galadriel lacks. And we could still have Galadriel play a role in the story, a very important role, and be sort of more the wise and good character that we sort of know her to be.
Yeah, and going off of that, what we've talked about in the past is how there's a difference between Tolkien writing some pretty obvious good and evil characters, and you kind of have an idea of I want to side with these people because you just want them to destroy, Frodo to destroy the ring and whatnot. But can I think about that and think about how in some ways great characters are the ones that who are having to struggle with certain things, and that stories are, at least Tolkien focuses on. Think of Frodo, for instance, or the Hobbits, or even just men. Those especially have I don't know, more epic stories. I feel that everybody likes.
Yeah.
And so this thing about that, I think that it would have been cool to see. I think we mentioned this in one episode, was Isildur, or maybe even Elendil in some way, also as being the main characters. Isildur I think would be pretty good because you could show his growing up, in a lot of ways. Kind of starting up where they do now, but he definitely has a lot of development in his character.
Yeah, I think actually that's a great point. I still think that we probably need a main elf character, and that Celebrian would fit really well. But I think that having Isildur be a much more main character, and you had mentioned that who is the main character in the story, and I sort of have this thought that does the Rings of Power just maybe not have too many characters in general? They have these 4 storylines, and each one's a lot of characters, and each one is sort of hard to figure out who is the main character, who do I care most about, and Lord of the Rings, how do you explain this? In Lord of the Rings, it starts off with Frodo, right? And Frodo goes along and he picks up friends and adventures. He picks up the other hobbits. He picks up Aragorn. Pick up the other members of the Fellowship of the Ring, and then eventually those members will split off. Eventually we'll have the 2 splits, and then the Merry and Pippin will split off, and so eventually we'll have these more splits. But it starts off of gaining momentum, and then it splits up. Whereas the Rings of Power starts off very split up, and tries to end more connected, where Galadriel and the Númenóreans come into the Southlands and connects these 2 storylines. But I think it makes it really hard to get invested in the characters as much. And yeah, I think they would really benefited from starting off with only like a single character and having them sort of go through, and then we can really experience Middle Earth through their eyes. I had this interesting thought of like making when you make Isildur the main character and having him start in Numenor and then like going to Middle Earth, and like that's how we get introduced to it in the story, right? In the show, and that could be really interesting. Like right, like not just some like popping on a scene in a certain place, but like seeing it like is through Isildur's eyes as he comes in maybe for the first time ever to land on Middle Earth and seeing the coast of Middle Earth. Yeah, I think Isildur, like you said, has like a lot of room for character growth. There's a lot of room for foreshadowing of future events, you know, because he plays a really significant role in beating Sauron and also losing in Temptation to the Ring. But yeah, and like as someone who is not an immortal elf princess, like having Isildur be like a main character would make very very like relatable. I think for a lot of people as a young guy who might not be super sure of his place in the world and stuff like that. And yeah, like he could be struggling with like, a lot of things that people are struggling with, and not like revenge fantasy sort of. You know what Galadriel
Hmm.
was going through.
Yeah, I think something to go off of what you said about just having kind of characters pop out of like nowhere in a way is almost what they is how they started the show in a sense, because as Meta said, they're almost trying to like create a Silmarillion show and like try to pick up the story about Galadriel that's already been happening. Um, but then at the same time, they also try to make it like there was nothing happening at all. Yeah, so that was just like an interesting like
Well,
kind of. It
yeah.
didn't seem like it wasn't like there was a character development, you know. It was almost
Mhm.
like they started with something already built and they tried to and they were just like moving the story along, kind of a thing.
No, yeah, I think also that like in other forms of media, like these big ensemble casts, you think of like Game of Thrones has a very large cast of characters that there's no specific main character a lot of the time. But also you think of like Marvel and stuff, and just other forms of media. These like ideas of these big ensemble casts where there's no like really main characters and there's a lot of people playing off of each other is like very very popular these days. And I think that's a lot of what Amazon was trying to do with the show, where you had like lots of different characters and a lot of different sort of like big actors, and no one was really playing the main character. I think that's felt very different than the Lord of the Rings movies felt. I think it sort of feels different than the way the Lord of the Rings stories feel. And maybe you should have felt they should have tried to tell a different story in a different way than just trying to repeat, you know, the MCU and Lord of the Rings. But yeah. So the other thought I had, which was
Right.
pretty interesting, I think, is rather than having the wizard be what I assume is Gandalf, you could have him be Saruman instead. And as Saruman is like traveling with the hobbits, he becomes very disenchanted with them, and like he desires more powerful peoples that he can use and maybe even manipulate to beat Sauron, and becomes very focused on winning about Sauron, not really about helping people. And you could really portray him as the anti-Gandalf character, where Gandalf is very personal with the hobbits. He loves hanging out with them, and you know he does fireworks for them. And Saruman could be this very overbearing and even tyrannical figure over them, to sort of foreshadow his eventual turning and sort of maybe even do some character development work for him, as like how did like Istari end up, you know, corrupted and sort of in the end trying to join with forces with Sauron, which would I think would be really interesting.
Yeah.
But
One thing I do kind of like is the idea of having a character that could be created that is new, but that character won't really have any bearing on like the actual storyline. So I think like the characters they do that with were Bronwyn and
Arondir, the
Arondir.
Southlands in general, right?
Yeah.
Um, I think it's really
Which
interesting, right?
yeah.
Like none of that storyline really fits with Tolkien's world. It's sort of just all of them, like right, like besides like sort of Mordor in general. Like, but we didn't really need an origin story for Mount Doom or Mordor in general. It was something they like just sort of added on. But that was really I felt like the place they made up a lot of stuff, and it actually was pretty great, right? I don't know. Sorry, we finished what you were going to say, but
Yeah, and not to go on like a this is a bit of a side tangent, but still kind of on the same thing. You have like Netflix. I don't know if you've seen, but apparently they are going to be making side story movies on Lord of the Rings. And people are like, well, like what's that? Like, how are they gonna do that? You know, are they gonna like use stories and dependencies or whatever? But yeah, like one thing is like you could talk about somebody in like Gondor or something or some place that does exist in Middle Earth, and kind of like have them going along with the main storyline, and yet having somebody who could still like fit with the theme that I think Tolkien to be writing.
Hmm.
But not that I didn't really think there was anyone who was written like that in the Lord of the Rings movies to a certain extent. Everybody who was the main character was actually from the books, as far as I know. Yeah.
Yeah, it's really interesting. I think because like the reason the Lord of the Rings were successful, and this is like not to like Peter Jackson is a fantastic director, but like they like pulled hard from Tolkien's storytelling abilities. And like you said, if you ever read the books, like they're pulling straight lines of dialogue out and straight scenes out, and obviously like to bring this to life is like a really unique talent. And like I think there's this idea like Tolkien is a master storyteller, so it's very safe to like, hey, we'll just focus really hard on Tolkien stories and like just try to recreate them, and it will turn out okay. But it's really interesting because in the Second Age, there isn't sort of this like storytelling, right? There is no sort of Lord of the Rings for the Second Age or the story they tried to tell. So I think they have to sort of go their own way and tell their own story. I think that you're right that like creating their own characters is a lot better than maybe, in my opinion, trying to tell like the story of Galadriel or Sauron or whatever, and sort of really messing it up. I think right because then you're like sort of rather than like I don't know. Some of my favorite parts and scenes in the show were coming from the Southlands. I think Arondir was a really interesting character and probably, in my opinion, the best actor in the show. Um, and also, like, you have this like fight scene where like the orc is coming in, and it's just the two of them against the orc, and the orc seems like so scary and powerful, and it's like really great with Bronwyn and Theo. But yeah, I think it's like this really like they really had some of the really creative and cool ideas. I think that they really applied in the Southland storyline, and I think maybe if they had gone more in that direction, the show would have been better off.
Yeah, I guess another thing that we have mentioned before too, but if you kind of think about like the evil side, you're talking about how like Saruman could have been a good alternative to Gandalf, and just thinking about that, like I think that what's the guy? What's the like the dark elf? What's his name?
Adar.
Adar. Yeah. So he definitely, I think, should have been a little more evil than he was. I think having him be more of a servant of Sauron would have made things a little more interesting. Because I mean, like, you don't really know, like, whenever Sauron gets back to Mordor, you don't really know what's going to happen. Because there's this idea of almost like rebellion, in a sense. So if he does return to Mordor, like, is Adar going to be, working with Sauron, or is he going to, like, try to get the orcs to go against him? Because in that one scene with, like, him and Galadriel and Haldir, he was almost seeing like, who is it? Was it Galadriel that was about to kill him? I think, and then Haldir prevented her, or was it the other way
No,
around?
Halbrand was about to kill Adar,
Halbrand. Did I
and
say
Halbrand is
Haldir?
Sauron. No, you're fine. That's the character in the movies. But
Yeah.
and Galadriel
Yeah.
prevents him.
Right. So
Yeah.
it has been. Maybe they're trying to just like throw more of a plot twist with it, but I guess like that would be one thing where like kind of building up the story, you have like this like as Mordor's being created, it's all being used for Sauron's purposes. So he's trying to build like an army that's gonna that he can like take and destroy everybody. But yeah,
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. I think Adar was fine. I would have just preferred a different portrayal of Sauron. I think looking back, the way they did the Halbrand Sauron reveal was like pretty well executed in the end, but like looking back, it just the show needed a more powerful portrayal of Sauron, a more evil portrayal of Sauron, a less conflicted portrayal of Sauron. That like they needed a bad guy consistently throughout the show that was sort of the force that they were afraid of, and sort of this like Halbrand. Like if you look back, you're like, why didn't he just kill Galadriel? Why didn't right? Like there's so many times Why did he pretend like he wanted to stay on Numenor? Like it seems like he almost did. Why did he go to like Middle Earth? I don't know. There's just so many questions, and like it's not someone you're really afraid of, or like seems to be driving the plot in any way. I guess is sort of my point. Like he shows up to give a little bit of advice with the rings, and then he's gone, and then it's like, yeah, I think they
Hmm.
could have done that very differently, and it would have been very turned out very well.
Yeah, and I feel like it builds a better story. I guess people might think that, oh, having everybody seem like there's some good side to them is like what people want, but like in the end, I think it makes a better story just to be like, hey, these are the bad guys, and everybody wants the good guys to win. You know what I mean?
No,
And they're
yeah,
sticking with them the whole entire time.
and it's the
So
kind of story you're telling, right? Like if you want to tell maybe a more grounded story, maybe it is sort of fun to like blur the lines, and everyone's has like, but this is a fantasy story, and that's not that kind of story. And yeah, tying in with that, I think like we need to have our like subvert the audience's expectations of like who is going to be the bad guy, who is it going to be, and stuff. Like you have to keep the audience guessing, and you have to do quick switches on them. I think that also is like not really fitting to the genre that they're trying to portray as well. I think both of
yeah,
those go hand in hand, is what I'm
hmm.
saying. I guess. Um,
Yeah,
both we need clear villains, and we don't need to have them be surprise villains.
right. Yeah, thinking about Lord of the Rings. They did create some of their own bad guys. Peter Jackson did, I guess, because you had like Lurtz and Gothmog, all right, the pig face guy.
Yeah,
Looked like he
actually,
was yogurt.
yeah, both of those are in the books, are they not?
Lurtz?
El- I think Gothmog is. You're correct that Lurtz, there is a orc chieftain who kills Boromir, but obviously, like, he's not given maybe as much
Okay.
screen time. Though, like, yeah, it's
Okay.
also like it's not like Lurtz plays a huge role in the movies, right? It's not like he has tons of dialogue or
Yeah.
something like
Right.
that,
Right.
right? So,
Yeah, but I'm saying
yeah,
like it's a safe option to create like more bad guys.
yes, yes.
Yeah.
And I do think like Adar was an interesting and cool villain. I feel like we needed an overarching baddie that like pushed the plot forward, and it just didn't feel like that was Adar. But
Yeah.
yeah,
No, I got you. Definitely.
yeah. The other thought I had is there's other parts of Elrond's character that I really liked the dwarf and the Durin and Elrond storyline. I think I'd mentioned before that like magic is a big part of Tolkien's world, and I didn't feel like they portrayed enough magic in the show. They have a little bit with the wizards, but not much besides that. I think Elrond is like sort of this quasi magical healer, and I thought that would have been a really cool idea. Rather than him just being sort of this political manipulator, we could have had him like, maybe Durin rather than him, sweet talking Durin. Maybe one of Durin's sons is sick or something, and Elrond ends up healing him through his abilities. And that would be a big way for him to regain trust or connection with people. Yeah, I thought that was another interesting idea.
No, yeah, yeah. Something that like back when we were like the show was running, one of us had made that like kind of prediction, like, oh, like he's gonna come back, Elrond's gonna heal him, Haldir, that is, like Haldir's gonna go back, Elrond's gonna heal him, but like Elrond didn't heal him. I don't
And
think
they
he
just had
did.
like four elves sitting around singing or something, and it was like very strange. It was like, yeah, this is
Yeah,
like Elrond is literally the most skilled healers of the elves. He's the one who taught Aragorn everything he knows, and yeah, it was just sort of like, right, like he's not only like a physical healer but also a magical healer. He's like both, and that would have been cool to see more of. And
hmm,
yeah, again, like right, like they also portrayed Galadriel as the commander of the Northern armies, like over and over again. Never in the books. She's like known as many things. She's like the White Lady or whatever, but never the commander of the Northern armies. And that was like the drum they just beat on for the show. There's this really fun thing. If you go on YouTube, you can like watch somebody count them up of how many times they say commander of the Northern armies, and it's a lot. So yeah, I think there's a couple other interesting parts that might be have been interesting to change as well. I sort of thought the idea of leaving out our Farazan's son and then switching Elendil's daughter to being our Farazan's daughter and having him be a romantic interest for Isildur might have been pretty interesting as well. Just sort of a fun counterplay between our Farazan and Elendil, I think, would have been interesting. But yeah, I think in general, the way they did Elendil's character was really interesting, where he's like sort of this random sea captain at the beginning of the story, and then like suddenly he takes on massive importance, and it's not really clear why. When in the books, it's like he's much more of a advisor figure to the king, and like plays a much more significant role and is a leader from the very get go. I think that would have been a better way of portraying him, perhaps, rather than sort of a random character that's just sort of caught in the right place at the right time by picking up Galadriel. He could have been like an actual leader of men and sort of foreshadowing that he'll be a king later on, right? So
Yeah, that's very good. And kind of going off of that, also with there aren't very many weapons that are besides. Okay, actually, all right, there's you have Galadriel's dagger, which it's kind of cool. Um, but if you think about like Elendil and like Narsil, like that would have been more of like kind of cool like idea if they would have put more of that aspect into things. About the sword, I don't know.
you're talking about Narsil?
Yeah, Narsil. Yeah, I think it would have been neat to have a little more unique, um, weapons kind of put into the storyline a little more. But
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting thought. As in terms of like not adding more magic, also not adding like sort of the terms of mystical weapons. It's really interesting because in the books, like Gimli's axes are like he has a very significant axe as well and stuff, and like yeah, so each of them has like Legolas also gets like an extra like a string from Galadriel to string his bow, I believe, or maybe one of the bows of the Galadriel hymn.
hmm
But yeah, how weapons play a much more significant role and is like significant to the characters, and it seems very generic. Where somehow like a Rondir has a bow at some point, and then he loses it, and then he has another bow, and it's like, yeah, I think that's a really interesting idea, and sort of in the vein of these medieval traditions, right? That weapons were passed down from generation to generation and very expensive, and were a big part of your family's like history and lore. So
yeah, I don't know. Like for at least for like me and like my especially me and my older brother like watching Lord of the Rings and everything like the swords and all were like something that we were like really into. Um, it was really cool. Like we would actually collect. We started collecting action figures. They're made by Hasbro, actually, and it was really neat because like you don't really like sometimes like you watch a movie, you don't always like kind of see like everything that they're wearing. You don't really get to like see all the details, but all the action figures that they have the swords, like all you know detailed just like in the movies, and so that was like something really cool to see, and um, yeah, it's like because the other thing was like we always like look for like the action figures that like got better. So we had the like Strider. Like Strider was everywhere. You could find Strider everywhere. But who is really rare is like Aragorn in his kingly regalia. That was something that you just didn't really like see around a whole lot. And like the sword with all the runes on it and everything. But yeah. So just kind of a note of all that.
yeah, that's really cool.
Any last comments?
Nope. Excited for when season two comes out to see how it turns out. But yeah.
Yes, yeah, one thing about season two that I hope, in a way, like I think because there are things that can be done better, and I hope that they like see that as they're producing things. Like if the 37% like completion rate is actually legit, that's them be like, all right, we need to improve this. Yeah.
Yeah, it's hard too because like right, like a season two, like I think a lot of people won't come back. I don't know. It'll be interesting to see, especially when they have these plans to like do 5 seasons. It's like man, like if they couldn't stick the landing with the first one, like there's no chance that they're gonna, at least not unless the budget drops like horrendously.
Yeah.
But
Yep.
yeah,
So it's definitely. I mean, especially for fans, of Lord of the Rings and just the books and all. It's fun to just talk about stuff and uh, give a give a critique for how you think you might make things better. Uh,
no, yeah, for sure.
but yeah,
Fan theory or fan fiction
yep.
of how we would make the story.
Yep.
But yeah.
All right, cool stuff, man. Thanks for visiting the White City. before you leave, please subscribe to our podcast and check us out at thewhitecitypodcast.com. Consider supporting my movement on Facebook, keeping the rings of power pure.